If we consider animation as just one piece of the pipeline where we have a bunch of different departments working on a project collaboratively, helping each other achieve some kind of a goal, oftentimes animation is going to export their data to another software, another set of artists in the department to hand it off for another set of tasks. And inside of Maya, we have a whole bunch of options for doing this. I thought I'd go through some of the most common ones so that whether you are working on your own and you're doing an indie production, or you are working professionally with other artists, you're prepared for what those projects need from you. Now, in this particular example, I've got a run cycle. This is just part of the larger animation that I've been showing you this whole time. I will go ahead and do the whole animation so we have all the fun stuff, but just to show you this, I want to point out something about cycles, because the first thing I want to show you is how to export to a game engine, Unreal Engine, Unity, things like that. To send your animation to a game engine, you actually won't be sending the whole character. You're only going to be sending the skeleton information. So if I come in here, I go to show, and then I just turn on the joints. In my particular case, that will show the character joints. I'm also going to go to display animation and then joint size. With this character, they're kind of big right now. I just want to show you what this looks like if it's a little bit tighter. There we go. This is what the character looks like under the hood. So if I make the character see-through, you can see that the mesh, the character themselves, is just being deformed by the skeleton underneath. This is the whole, rigging process. But when it comes to a game engine, Unreal, for example, does not need the character's mesh from Maya. When you're sending your actual animation work, you won't be sending the full character. You'll only be sending this skeletal data. And so let me show you how this works. When it comes to cycles in general, I just want to point out that if frame 1 and frame 19, in my case, are the exact same pose, I don't actually want to send 1 to 19. I want to send 1 to 18. I don't want the first and last frame, because if I play through this, I get the first and the last frame matching exactly, which is great for the cycle. But what would happen if I just hit play every single time is you're going to see frame 18, then frame 19, and then it's going to play the next frame, which is the same frame, which means we just saw the same thing twice. But when exporting your animation, you might also need to have one additional frame at the very beginning, your T-pose. The T-pose is for exporting the character and the skeleton to prepare us to be able to bring the animation in. And so if I wanted to first send out the character, I'll go ahead and make my character selectable, and I'll open the outliner. Now in this particular case, what I have is the character mesh as well as my armature. So it's got the whole joint chain inside of there, and then the controls are separate. We don't need the controls. Our exports will never care about our animation controls because the rig won't be alive once we export it. It's either going to be just the mesh data or just the skeletal data. So if we're sending our work to Unreal, for example, if I go to File, there is an option for send to Unity, send to Unreal, things like that. There's even a Live Link plugin, which won't be there by default. You can install it and you can do some really cool stuff. But the game exporter is what we care about. This makes it really easy. And you'll see that there are a few tabs at the top. The time editor, which we're not going to talk about today, the animation clips of how we actually export our animation data, and the model section. This is where you would select your mesh and your skeleton. And you might want to select the entire skeleton hierarchy, and the way you do that would be to click the top level, go to Select, and then Hierarchy. That'll grab everything in this hierarchy, and then I'll shift-click to select the character. And so that is how I would select just the character for this process. I would export my selection, and I would give it a name, all that kind of stuff. And this would be to just take the character, send it to Unreal. Again, there's more complexities depending on what character you're using. Once that's done, to actually export the animation data, or if you're doing motion capture, you want to do retargeting, you can kind of bypass that whole thing I just showed you. I just want to address it really quick. What I can do here is if I select the skeleton data, right? So that's going to actually grab the joint hierarchy. You might also, again, select hierarchy, grab everything in between. But if I grab this root, I'll just use the top level control. I will just say animation clips, export selection, and I'm going to create an animation clip. So I will hit the plus button, and then I'll give it a name. So I'll say start frame 1 to 18. We're going to hit this button. It'll chop it to the same thing I have in my timeline. So if I want this whole thing, I can change this to 1 to, I think it's 126 actually, because 127 is, again, that loop point, which is the same as 1. So I want back a frame, I want 126. And I'll give it a name, anim_dive scramble. Sure. _01. I like to give my names the number. That way, if I need to do multiple versions, it's easy to keep track of. And then we need to check the settings. Make sure that the bake animation checkbox is turned on, so it's actually gonna get the animation data. And we will go ahead and change the path to wherever we wanna go. I typically like to use the data folder that it gives us in our project window, but you can put it anywhere. This is also using the Maya set project. If you wanna just throw it on your desktop, that's fine too. Just put it somewhere you can keep track of it. I'll hit choose, and I'll give it a name, which is up here, and I'll hit export. See how quick that went? That was like instant. I'm suspicious of that. I don't think it actually got what I wanted. So I think in this case with this rig, I want to select my root, select hierarchy. I'm going to try one more time, change this to 03, hit export again. That time it took a second. I actually saw my playhead move, and I think that's going to work better. Because now if I jump into my folder, you can see I have anim scramble 1, 2, and 3.fbx. Your animation data to game engines goes in the FBX file format, typically. And you can see that these are 27 kilobytes and this is 1.2 megabytes. So this is a bigger file, there's more in there, and that's probably because these only contain the root bone. This actually contains more information. This animation data we could bring into Unreal. We could now load this up with really any rig, any character that's set up over there, and we can attach any mesh to it. That's what's cool about animation data in this way, is that this skeleton can deform any model. As far as animators, our job is complete. But that's how you use the game exporter and how you export your animation for games. Now, one more thing I want to show you is what happens when you want to actually just export the animation data for film workflows, for commercials, for something that you're going to send to an effects artist or for a lighting artist. Because those artists don't need to be retargeting stuff, they just want to have your character. Whatever it was that your camera saw, this whole thing right here, this is what they need. And so let me show you what we do. If you want to export the actual character information, this is the same workflow that we used at DreamWorks, and I've got some modifications to it as well. If I go to frame 1, once again, I don't need the T-pose in this particular case, and frame 126, there's my whole shot. Character's gonna go running off and doing his thing. I'll select the character, and I actually just wanna select the character's mesh at this point. I'm gonna go to File, Export Selection, and I'll go to the little option box. So it asks, okay, how do you want to export your file? And you can choose from all kinds of different things, but the ones we care about are an Alembic and a USD. Now, the Alembic is the most common way, and it's an older way, and it's totally great. It works wonderfully, but it's not the one that I prefer. It's also not in this menu. The Alembic export lives somewhere else, and I'll show you where that is second. But the recommended workflow that I like to show is USD. If I scroll down, there is a USD export and an Arnold USD. I just want regular USD export. If you're working with a team and they have certain requirements, great. But in most cases, you don't really need to worry about this. The only thing you do need to check is animation data. Just turn that on. Otherwise, you just get the one frame. So we'll make sure that we get our frame range, which is why I changed it here. We want to change this from 1 to 126 in my particular case. Every single frame. If you haven't done the Euler filter, which adjusts rotations, it can do that on bake. I don't need to worry about that because I've already handled it. And now we'll say export selection. So I'll go back to my data folder. I'll call this anim _ dive scramble 01. This time it's a USD file, so 01 is fine because there's FBX, now there's USD. It's not gonna hurt anything. Export selection. Runs through the timeline. It's pretty quick, as you can see. And then while we're here, I'll just show you the Alembic one too. Up in animation, I'm actually gonna switch to effects. I'm gonna come up to cache, and this menu is not here if you're not in the effects menu set, but I go to the cache menu set, Alembic cache, and I'm going to export selection to Alembic, option box. And it's basically the same steps over again. I'm going to use my time slider, or I could specify start and end frames of 1 to 126. I'm going to scroll down, and there's one extra thing I need to check here. UV right. You want to make sure you hit that button. Otherwise, the texture information for this character is not going to connect properly because the mesh has UV data, which is how it knows how to lay the textures onto the geometry. We can now say export selection, and we can make sure that we are, set to an Alembic file type. We'll call this anim _ dive scramble 01, another file type. Export selection. It also runs pretty quickly. And just to prove that this worked, I'm actually going to open up a different software entirely. We're going to jump into Blender because it opens really fast. So in Blender, I go to Import, Alembic. I navigate to the location where my file is, and I can go ahead and double click that Alembic file. And right there, you can see we've got our animation live playing in Blender. Obviously the rig is no longer there because the rig is not compatible, but the animation data is there exactly as we expect. Now, File, import one more time, USD, and I'll do the same thing. I'll bring in the USD file. Now they're pretty much on top of each other, so I need to move one of them over a little bit. There you go. USD and Alembic both work great. The animation meshes here will be completely identical. You won't be able to tell them apart. However, the reason I recommend using USD most of the time is because if I go to the folder where these files are saved, the FBX file that we had from the game animation is only 1.2 megabytes. It's very small because it's literally just the skeleton and a bunch of rotation translation information. It's just a text file, basically. The USD and the Alembic actually have the mesh data, so they're going to be heavier. But the USD file, which stands for Universal Scene Description, it is only 21 megabytes, where the Alembic file is 104 megabytes. It's like 5 times as big, and it's a lot heavier. Pretty much compatible in any software application, which is really nice. If we had a much, much heavier rig and we used the Alembic file, it might not play back at 24 FPS, but the USD one definitely would. It's just a lighter file type and a bit more effective for playing back animation. My recommendation from here is to try it yourself, do the export, and if you bring it to something like Blender or back into Maya, try to reconnect your textures and just make sure it works. And that'll show that you're ready to use this in a professional capacity.